We left off last video on the peroxisome and covering around half of the necessary organelles to know at the pre-IP biology level in the cell. So let's continue today. And we'll start off with the vacuole, just going in a counterclockwise order. Went over peroxisomes and now vacuoles. The vacuole. And I'll actually change my color to white here. The main purpose of the vacuole is to store water and food. There are two main things to note about the vacuole. First, that the vacuole can release its contents if the cell becomes too large or is about to burst. At the same time, it can also gain contents if the cell becomes too small and it needs some sort of rejuvenation or resources in the form of water and food. And it's really used to store this water and food for a later time. The second biggest thing about vacuoles, and one of the most important things to know about the vacuole, is its differentiation within plants and animals. In plants, the vacuole is significantly larger than the one in animals. Taking a plant cell to be somewhat like this, the vacuole is around this big in comparison to the cell, while on animals, it's significantly smaller. If we take a cell somewhat like this, a crude drawing, it's much smaller, maybe something like this. And this happens for one main reason. It's because plants can't move around to actually get the water and food they need. Animals can move around and get water from a lake, but plants have to make the most out of what they have. So if it starts raining, for example, plants must store as much water it can from the rain because later on they won't have access to it. Now, past the vacuole, we have to go next again in the clockwise direction to the centrosome. The centrosome. Now, its main function is quite simple. It creates spindle fibers to attach during cell division. Cell division is commonly known in two main ways, mitosis and meiosis. And they're very complex processes that deserve a video of their own. But overall, the main function of a centrosome is to just create these spindle fibers, and it's nothing too special, really. Moving on again, another important organelle is the chloroplast. The chloroplast. Important thing to note is that it's only found in plants. Much like the mitochondria, which you see here, it has two membranes, and inside it has thylakoids, which you don't really need to know at this stage of biology, and it contains chlorophyll. And its main process is to carry out photosynthesis. The purpose of photosynthesis is to convert light to sugars. And again, much like transcription, much like mitosis, meiosis, and much like cellular respiration, this process is something that we need to explore a little bit more in depth in a future video because it's something that is quite tested on. So now that we've got much of the endomembrane organelles, or membrane-bound organelles, we can now look at some of the exterior ones. We've talked about the lipid bilayer, also known as the cell membrane. And now let's talk about this outer green shell almost. This is known as the cell wall. And once again, just like the chloroplast is only in plants. We talked about how the cell membrane is important as it transports items in and out. And the cell wall is not exactly the same. The cell wall, its main use is to protect the cell. And it's a very rigid wall that ensures that the plant cell is safe even if it's hurt physically or somebody steps on it. and to the likings of that. What's important to note is that it's not a true wall, as in there is some porous areas. These are called plasmodesmata. Again, it's something that you really don't need to know at the pre-AP biology level, but it's important to keep in mind if you're going to progress through biology as a science. So when we look at the cell wall, it's important to also note the main differences between plant and animal cells that we can see within organelles. First, we have the chloroplast, which is only found in plants. Secondly, we have the size of the vacuole, which is bigger in plants. And lastly, we have the cell wall, which is only found in plants again. And now, for the penultimate organelle, we have the flagella or cilia. This is an organelle found mainly in unicellular organisms that provide motility to the cell, which means that using the cilia or flagella, the cell can actually move around in whatever solution it's based in. And essentially, that's the main functionality of it. There's nothing too much in depth. Another thing, and maybe the most interesting organelle within this entirety of the cell, is the cytoskeleton. What's important to note about the cytoskeleton is that it is extremely small, to the point where many textbooks don't even show the cytoskeleton at all. But it's really important in the cell and its functionality. The cytoskeleton is, well, if we depict it like straight lines, is essentially a skeleton that crosses through the entirety of the cell that transports certain objects and made out of microtubules and microfilaments that help transport proteins and also help keep the cell afloat, because if there's no cytoskeleton, there's really no support for the cell. And overall, the cytoskeleton can provide as an important object to ensure that the cell stays safe and that it doesn't collapse on itself. Also, an important thing to note is that the cell isn't spaced out as widely as this. The mitochondria aren't so far away from the nucleus, the endomembrane system isn't spread apart this wide. And that's because within a cell, it has to be as efficient as possible. So what we'll see is that the nucleus will be right next to the endoplasmic reticulum, which is right next to the Golgi apparatus, to increase efficiency. The main reason that we spread out these organelles within the cell is just to make it easier to locate the organelles and to identify its functionality. And with that, we've covered the basics of all organelles that we need to know, ranging from the nucleus to the cell wall to the cilia to even the very minuscule cytoskeleton. This is the basic overview of the cell.